know any if you know anyone who would have liked to be on this call but could not, or if you just want to watch the call back later, type your email address into the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen, and I'll make sure that I get the call to you once it's downloaded on my computer. And then finally, I'm really excited to introduce our special guest, Dusty Breeding. I met Dusty almost 8 years ago when I started my career at Lululemon, actually through working alongside his wife, Cecily, who's also incredible if you know her. I always thought Dusty would be an amazing brand ambassador, and as he talks and you get to know him, I'm sure you'll share that sentiment. Although he admitted that back 8 years ago, our product was a little too bright and neon for him to ever consider wearing. But thankfully in time, our product evolved, and the Malibu location actually snapped Dusty up as an ambassador back in 2015. But when he completed his term with their store, Calabasas just took him right back, and he's pretty much been an ambassador ever since, many years now. And then what do I say about Dusty? He doesn't like the word influencer, so I won't use that word. But what I will say is that he's a leader. And he's the best kind of leader to follow because he leads through thought, word, and deed. And Dusty and I actually met back in February because we wanted to bring this information to our community before everything happened with COVID-19. And we envisioned it as this like outdoor experience in a big group, which for obvious reasons we can't do now. But I actually think that what's going on in the world currently has made the research Dusty has and his unique perspective on traumatizing experiences like even more relevant and applicable. So I'll let him tell his own story. And so without further ado, please welcome our speaker, Dusty Breeding.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you so much for putting this together, and thank you all for being willing to spend some time with us today. I'm hoping to enter into a dialogue and discussion with you over the next 35 to 45 minutes. So before we begin, if you have access to a pencil and paper, that would be really helpful today. You can always type things in your phone and put it on your computer, but there is something about the process of putting a pen to paper that I think is really powerful. So I would encourage you to grab one of those if you have one of those laying around. Again, big thanks to Lululemon Calabasas for hosting. As Jen said, I've been connected with Lululemon for many years, and I always say that Lululemon, they do sell yoga clothes, but I've always seen them as a leadership development company. They have poured into me and invested in my ideas and things that I've done in a way that no business ever has. And it's very abnormal. I think that they are an industry trend setter in the way they support their people. So thank you all for your support of me. For those of you who don't know me, I serve as the campus pastor at Pepperdine University. I've been here for about 10 years now. I'm a CrossFit coach. I've been a Lululemon ambassador for many years. And I did my undergraduate and my master's degree here at Pepperdine, which is where I met my wife, Cecily. So something that you should know about us is that we love to travel. Cecily and I got married in Kenya. It's been our first year of marriage, living in Kenya. And one of the practices that we do in our marriage is that we trade off picking family vacations. So one year she'll pick a family vacation, and then the next year I'll pick a family vacation. And so we kind of go back and forth. Well, a few years ago, we were sitting in my kitchen and we were drinking a cup of coffee, and we were discussing which vacation was our favorite. What was the best trip that we've ever gone on? And so we started reviewing some of the trips that we've been on. We thought about the time we spent a couple weeks in Rome or in Italy, drinking wine in Rome or hiking Cinque Terre. Or we thought about the time that we traveled to Turkey and strolling through the markets of Istanbul, or backpacking in Alaska. But ultimately, the trip that we decided on that was our favorite, most high impact experience was our summit of Mount Kilimanjaro. So back in 2016, we made a trip to Tanzania to climb Kilimanjaro, which is one of the 7 summits. It's the tallest mountain in Africa. And if you've ever done it, you know it is a huge physical challenge. It's not a technical mountain, so you don't need mountaineering skills, but you need lots of grit. And we learned that over the course of our 5-day trip. I'll never forget waking up at midnight on the day of summit and then spending the next 8 hours pushing our way to the top of this crazy tall mountain. And at the very top of the mountain, I made it. I summited. I want to share my screen so you can see proof that we got there. But that was just, as they say, the summit is just halfway. So once we got up to the top, I ended up developing altitude sickness. I threw up all over the top of the mountain, left lots of vomit up there for others to see, and then spent the next 7 or 8 hours basically stumbling down the mountain, needing to be assisted, helped by our guides. Cecily helped me. Looking back, like I would absolutely say that was the biggest physical challenge that I've ever experienced. And it was a moment where I wasn't sure that I could do it. So I want to pause for a second, and I would love to see in the chat, I would love to hear from you. Is there a challenge that you've engaged in, a physical challenge or some other type of challenge that you've engaged in? What has been really hard for you to do? So take a moment and you can drop some things into the chat. Love to hear from you. Physical challenge, maybe the biggest challenge, mental, physical, that you've experienced. Running a marathon, Christina, awesome. That's great. Being pregnant, I have not experienced that challenge, but I could imagine that's really tough. Climbing Mount Fuji, awesome. Seal fit, awesome, Matt. Yeah, I remember seeing that you did that with the Kokoro camp. That's great. Kendo, passing 4-Dan, that sounds awesome. Swim, triathlon, cool. Pregnancy, architecture school, testing, I can imagine. All those things are very challenging. Yeah, learning to manage depression, anxiety, for sure. Huge challenge. Triathlon. So go ahead and keep typing those in so we can all get a little picture of some of the things that we've done that have been challenging. One of the things that I think is unique about these challenges is that often we look back on those moments as being, in some ways, some of the best moments of our life. We look back at that time of struggle, the time of challenge, as being a moment where we grew and a moment that we look back on with positivity. And that concept of why we look at these big struggles, these big challenges, why we look back at them with positivity, that really captured my attention a few years ago and became the focus of my research for my master's thesis. So I spent about 2 years diving into literature related to this topic and really posing the question, why do we like challenging things and what happens to us as we engage with them? And what I'm sharing with you today is really what I would call kind of a part 1 of maybe a part 2 series or part 2 concept. And this is kind of packing the parachute before you go skydiving, right? You can't just jump out of the plane without packing your pack, right? So the first thing that we're doing here today is packing your parachute into your pack. We're getting a foundation for some of the concepts. And once we have a deeper understanding of what these things are, then we can start to leverage them for our own individual and collective growth. So one of the things that I want to do today is I want to use the coronavirus pandemic as essentially our object lesson for this conversation. Many of you are experiencing a really difficult time. I think we all are. I was reading today that the number of deaths in the United States is something like 42,000 Americans. I read that 26 million Americans have lost their jobs, looking at a 15 to 20% unemployment rate for the month of April, which is just crazy. In March, there was a 338% increase to emotional support call centers. So we're not just facing physical challenges, but there's some serious emotional challenges. I was also reading in California, there was a particular suicide hotline that had doubled their calls. They typically were getting around 100 a day. Now they're getting 200 calls per day. So it's clear that we as a community are experiencing stress. And stress is something that we've all experienced and it's been a part of the human story since the dawn of existence. If you look back at history, famine, pandemics, war, none of these things are particularly new. And our ability to endure them isn't new either. If you look at the Christian story, history of Christianity, the story of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus is a story of overcoming. If you think about Greek mythology, the story of the phoenix rising up from the ashes. Even in pop culture, the story of Batman, the story of this caped crusader only came about because of the fact that he saw his parents being brutally murdered. So this idea of growth in the aftermath of trauma isn't necessarily new, but what I think is new is that we have a term for it now. It's called post-traumatic growth. And I think understanding this is critical to not only leading yourself through a difficult time, but also leading the communities in which we live and work through a global pandemic. So I want to pause again for a second, and I would love for you to go to the chat. Can you think of other stories in history, other myths, other pop culture references where someone has not only endured a challenge, but has grown from a challenge? So let's take a moment to pause. Love to get your feedback. Other stories in history, other myths, other pop culture references. Where have you seen this idea of people or pop culture references where people have overcome a challenge? American Revolution, Madam C.J. Walker, Harry Potter, yeah, D-Day, absolutely. Totally. Little Engine That Could, a classic. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay, so I imagine if you continue to think about it, there are a lot of references in pop culture or throughout history where this has been experienced. But what I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit about the science of why that exists. Why do those myths and why do those stories exist? All right. So post-traumatic growth is defined as the positive psychological change that results from a struggle through a life-altering experience. There have been hundreds of studies done that have shown that post-traumatic growth exists. There was a study done on Vietnam prisoners of war, and 62% of the men who lived in POW camps said that they ultimately benefited from that experience, from the experience of being a prisoner of war, that they ultimately benefited. A few years ago, there was a study conducted on women who were divorced, and of this study, 40% of the women showed an increase in psychological functioning 10 years after their divorce. There was another study conducted on parents and children who had a serious pediatric illness, and growth was reported among those families throughout the process that they endured. So one of the things that you may be asking is how do we know that they experience growth? How is this measured? And that is a great question. The tool that's used is what's called the post-traumatic growth inventory. And we're gonna, just a little teaser, we're actually going to take the post-traumatic growth inventory test here in just a little bit. But essentially the inventory is a self-report questionnaire where you respond to 21 different questions. And from those 21 different questions, psychologists have found 5 domains of growth that exist. So of the 5 domains of growth, here's the breakdown. Personal strength. Personal strength is your ability to face the challenge. But I would say maybe more importantly, it's your ability to accept yourself as you are. So letting go of self-judgment, letting go of fears of inadequacy. A second area for growth or domain for growth is relationship with others. The reality is that suffering is painful, but suffering alone is worse. So trauma offers the opportunity to assess our relationships. We can appreciate the good ones, and it gives us an opportunity to cut the toxic ones from our lives as well. So people who have gone through a traumatic experience often report feeling a deeper emotional connection in their interpersonal relationships. The third domain for growth is what's called appreciation for life. And if you've ever run a marathon, I know Christina mentioned that she had, if you've ever gotten to the marathon, they typically will give you like a banana or a beer, and it's usually like a really crappy beer, like a PBR or a Keystone Light. And if you've run a marathon and drank that beer, ate that banana, you would say that's the best beer you've ever had in your life, or that's the best banana you've ever had in your life. So that kind of captures this idea that when you go through a struggle, when you go through something traumatic, it's common for people to have a much deeper appreciation for things in their life. The fourth domain for growth is what's called existential or spiritual change. And this often results from the trauma when it forces you to ask big questions about who you are or why you are here, or what is the purpose for existence. And the fifth area of domain for post-traumatic growth is new possibilities. And this domain can be seen when someone takes on a new path in life. So often after trauma, and people start asking big questions, they'll start saying, where am I going? Am I doing the work that I want to do? Am I being the person that I want to be? And often people end up living a life that is maybe more true to who they actually desire to be or who they are at their core in the aftermath of trauma. So here's what I want to do now. We're going to test you to see if you've experienced any post-traumatic growth through the coronavirus pandemic. So the way this is going to work is on your piece of paper, you're going to be able to respond to basically a mini version of the post-traumatic growth inventory. So what I've done is I've selected a few questions, 5 out of the 21, that will help us assess your experience of trauma, basically over the last 5 weeks or so. So what I want you to do is I want you to read through these questions, and then on a scale of 0 to 5, obviously 0 being that you've experienced no growth in this area, and 5 being that you've experienced tremendous growth in this area, rate yourself on these questions, 1 through 5. So question 1, or statement 1, I have more compassion for others. Would you say 0, the pandemic has given me no more compassion, or would you say 5, tremendous growth? Question 2, or statement 2, I developed new interests. Would you say no new interests, or maybe yeah, I've developed a few, or absolutely, I've found so many new interests. Statement 3 is I have a greater feeling of self-reliance, 0 to 5. Statement 4, I have a stronger religious faith. Has the experience of being in quarantine or during a pandemic, has that changed your religious faith? And then statement 5, I changed my priorities about what is important in life. Again, 0 to 5. So I imagine for each of these, you have a different numerical figure. And one of the things that comes out of the research is that you don't necessarily experience growth in all 5 of the domains. Sometimes you experience growth in some and not in others. So what we're going to do is we're going to assess your growth and attach it to the domains. So the next slide that I just posted up shows you essentially what area or what domain of growth corresponds with these questions. So in the compassion for others, if you said 5, that would fall into this domain of relating to others. And that would indicate that you've experienced growth in your relationship with others. Developing new interests corresponds with the new possibilities. Greater feeling of self-reliance, that connects with personal strength. Stronger religious faith connects with that concept of spiritual change. And then change in your priorities about what is important, that connects with the concept of the appreciation for life. So what this inventory essentially does is it allows researchers to assess where people have grown. And as I mentioned, people can experience different levels of growth. People can experience it in certain areas and not in others. But I think we can all agree that growth in the aftermath of trauma is a good thing. But it also comes at a really high price. Like, no one is raising their hand and volunteering and saying like, yeah, I would love to go through a really traumatic instance just so I can come up with some new possibilities for my life, right? No one's signing up to experience a car crash. No one would volunteer to experience cancer or lose a loved one to a pandemic. Lawrence Calhoun, one of the key researchers in post-traumatic growth studies, says and describes post-traumatic growth as a terrible gift. That post-traumatic growth is a terrible gift. So what I want to do next, and this connects with this concept of the practice of adversity, I want to acknowledge that trauma is terrible, but I want us to consider how can we make it a terrible gift, right? So how can we leverage what you're experiencing or what happens when we face adversity? How can we leverage that and make it a terrible gift? So in the research of post-traumatic growth, a couple things have come out. Two specific things that are indicators and are components to growth during trauma are your readiness and willingness to change. So within you, being ready to do it, and then also having a sense of control over your life. One of the things that stood out in all the research is that when someone goes through a traumatic experience, a lot of times it's not necessarily the physical trauma or the danger that they're in, but it's how that affected their sense of control or their identity, their sense of self, right? So for example, if you felt like you were a strong individual, but you experienced a robbery, that could have shattered what you believe to be true about yourself, right? And so often that is what is most traumatic. And so these two components of trying to regain control and then also being willing to grow are critical for trauma, for growth through trauma. So what I want to introduce to you today is what I would call the practice of adversity. And this is the idea of taking a challenging situation and taking it from being terrible to being a terrible gift. So step one in this methodology of the practice of adversity is what I call reframing the experience. So as I mentioned, one of the most traumatic things that you experience through adversity is the feeling of losing control. So reframing the experience is a tool that we can use to regain control over something or some component of the process. So I want to suggest that quarantine life has forced some circumstances onto us. I want to suggest that it has forced inactivity onto us. It has forced isolation onto us, and it has forced boredom onto our lives. But step one for our methodology is reframing those experiences. So what I want you to consider is that instead of seeing those as they are, instead of inactivity, can you embrace movement? Instead of isolation, can you embrace solitude? Instead of boredom, can you embrace creativity? So step one of the practice of adversity is beginning to reframe your experience for a positive reappraisal. So you can look back at this and take some sense of control back from the challenge that you're facing. So what I want you to do now is on your piece of paper, I want you to write down which of those three really landed with you. And I want you to write it like this. I want you to say, I am choosing movement, or I am choosing solitude, or I am choosing creativity. And that positive statement is one way of reframing your experience. So that's step one of the methodology. Step two of the methodology is mindful meditation. So mindful meditation is what's practiced during the stress, during your moment of adversity, during the moments in the day when you're feeling the anxiousness of inactivity or the anxiousness of boredom or of isolation. And what you're going to do in the practice, this step two, is you are going to return to that statement. Return to the statement of your meditation that you made first, the I am choosing creativity. And you're going to implement that. You're going to say that in your head for 10 minutes. You're going to set aside 10 minutes of your day or stop for 10 minutes and ruminate on this idea. And the way I like to do it is essentially through the concept of what we would call breath prayer. So as you're inhaling and you're saying to yourself on the inhale, I am embracing creativity. And then exhale. And then you're repeating that process. So setting aside 10 minutes. And then I want to challenge you to do that 3 times in your week for 2 weeks. And those numbers are specific. Research has shown that the practice of mindful meditation is most powerful at this, or its minimum effective dose is this amount. So if you do it more, it's more effective. But at minimum, capturing this 10 minutes a day, 3 times in the week for 2 weeks is essentially the minimum effective dose. All right, so that's step 2. And it's really critical for the growth and development in step 2 that you're pairing this with the moment of adversity, right? So when you're feeling those thoughts and feeling those emotions of stress, that's when you're practicing this mindful meditation. You can do it at all times throughout the day, but what we're really trying to do is we're trying to leverage what's happening in your brain during stress and during anxiety and attach it to this reframed experience. So step 3 in the methodology is what I call communal response. So sharing about your experience is essential to growth. And this 3rd step is all about openness. It's all about vulnerability and expressing what's going on in your life. And I think this is where you make the growth and that experience of growth real for yourself, but also where you begin the process of helping others grow through their experience as well. So here's what I want us to do together. We're going to do something that I call a friend map. So on the piece of paper, if you could turn it over, you're going to draw 4 concentric circles. So it'll essentially look a bit like a target. All right. So you've got this target on your paper, and what we're going to do is we're mapping your friends and your emotional connection to them. So on the outer rung of this circle, I want you to take a moment and I want you to write the names of 1 or 2 people who you would consider to be acquaintances. These could be the barista at the coffee shop that you go to every day. It could be the guy who works in a cubicle across the office from you, or it could be your Uber driver as she drives you to work every day. So can you come up with 1 or 2 names of people that you would call acquaintances in your life? They're going to go on the outer rung. Take just a moment for you to do that. Then on that next rung of this concentric circles friend map, I call this the friends that you sweat with, right? So these are the people that you call for a workout. If you're going for a run and you want to get a group of people together, these are the people that you call. Or if you're doing something fun, if you're heading to the beach and you want to play beach volleyball, these are the friends that get that call. Can you write down the name of 1 or 2 or maybe 3 people who you would call at that level of friendship? And then the next circle, these are the people that you tell your secrets to. So these are friends that you are closer with. It's probably a much smaller number. Maybe it's only 2 or 3 people. The people that you would call to tell them that you got a new job when you haven't told your boss yet, or the people that you call before you post on Facebook that you're pregnant, right? So these are the people that are close enough to you that you trust, and you take joy in the emotional connection that you have with them. So can you think of 1 or 2 people on that level of your relationship? And this last circle takes a little bit of explaining. My college roommate always told me that there was a way you could tell a good friend from a best friend. And the way you could tell a good friend from a best friend is if you were to kill someone, you could tell a good friend and they would keep it a secret. But a best friend would help you bury the body. So this inner circle, these are your bury the body friends. It's likely that you have very few people at this level of relationship with you. These are really close-knit relationships where you feel completely honest and safe in sharing anything with that person. So at this point, you should have a handful of names on your map here, on your friend map. And what I want to do now is I want you to think about this idea of communal response. So you have reframed your experience. You've been practicing your mindful meditation for the last couple weeks as you've been thinking about reclaiming control over a very chaotic situation. So research shows that it's really critical that you use the experiences that you've been through and that you are open and vulnerable as you describe your struggles and also your successes. this is the way that you take it from being just meaningful for you to being meaningful for others. So your challenge is, can you identify someone on this concentric circle map, your friend map? Can you identify someone that you're willing to be open and honest and share about the challenges that you faced? And then also this tool, this practice of adversity, can you describe and explain to them how they could also do this for their own personal growth? All right, so that's your practice of adversity. So for the next 2 weeks, I want to challenge you that 3 times a week for 10 minutes per session, that you are practicing your mindful meditation, that you are reclaiming some control in the midst of this chaotic situation. And then at the end of your 2 weeks, you are then sharing that with your community so that you're able to reflect on the growth that you've experienced, but also with the hopes that it may impact someone else. So I want to pause there and just open it up to you. Do you have comments? Do you have thoughts, questions that have come up for you? I see Bonnie Moeller, not your spouse. Yeah, absolutely could be your spouse. Definitely. I would say my spouse is my bury a body friend. Cecily's my bury a body friend for sure. Other thoughts, other questions?
You guys can feel free to pop off mute. Now is a good time. Okay, well, I'm always willing to be vulnerable, so I'll ask the question. You said that, like, in your ideal, this is packing the parachute. So if this talk was part 1 of a 3-part series, I'm curious about what the other 2 parts look like.
Yeah.
Like, what are some of the next steps with this work?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So what I hope to have shared with you today is expanded the possibility for understanding that science supports what you've always known to be true, that you can grow through challenging things. So once that's been established, it's kind of like knowing the rules. Now you can start to break the rules. So a big area for my research for my master's thesis is what I call elective stress. And that is essentially taking this concept and then practicing by choosing to put yourself in adverse situations, by choosing to do that, by practicing this practice of adversity, of elective stress, you can also experience growth. And so what that looks like on a practical level, I've actually been doing it over the last couple of weeks. About a month ago, I was really ruminating on the fact that I'm a critical thinker, and in conversation, I can be very critical. My questions can really shut down great ideas. And I recognize that within my marriage and within my working with my coworkers. And so I saw that as an area for growth. It was an area that I wanted to grow in. And so what I've done is I've selected a mindful meditation. It's a statement that I've been repeating in the midst of exercise. So in the midst of adversity, I've been saying to myself, it's a proverb from the Bible, death and life are in the power of the tongue. I choose life. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. I choose life. And what that has done for me is I have ruminated on that in the midst of exercise, in the midst of a really sweaty CrossFit workout, has allowed me to disconnect from the suffering, metaphoric suffering that I'm experiencing in the workout, and then focus on possibility, essentially. So focus on an area for growth that I desire to experience. So that's an example of what I would say is kind of the next step of this process, is thinking how can you leverage the reality that adversity can produce growth? How do you leverage that for things and areas of your life that you want to grow in? So in some ways, today's conversation is kind of like putting your oxygen mask on first in an airplane. It's making sure that you're okay. And then the next step is thinking, all right, what can I do with that next? Other thoughts, comments, questions? Has anyone experienced this before?
Wait, I have a question.
Yeah.
So going into the circle, can you explain again how the friend falls into each step? So the circle of friends is so that you can open yourself up and start Can you go?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Yeah. So the friend map is a way of challenging you to look at the people in your life and recognize where they exist in your emotional connection to them. And then the action step would be selecting someone from one of those areas and being open and being vulnerable with them. All right. So that's what I would call, in CrossFit lingo, I would call that the prescription. So that's like the base level for growth is who can you share this with? But I would say if you wanted to go RX plus, if you wanted to step it up, one of the things that you can do to grow further is look at your concentric circles and consider, is there a friend on there that you could move to a deeper level of friendship, a deeper level of emotional connection by having this conversation? So is there someone, is there a friend that you sweat with that could be a tell your secrets friend? And how could you use this practice to help usher you into a deeper emotional connection with them?
Okay, thank you.
Dusty, I have a question. Regarding the 10 minutes of the mindful meditation.
Yeah.
How do we do that again? Like,
yeah.
What do we think about?
Yeah, totally. Well, for this particular practice, I've essentially given it to you. Like I said, the kind of next level is crafting your own. But essentially, you're returning to this idea of trying to maintain or take back control of an uncontrolled situation. So my challenge to you was to repeat the mindful meditation, the statement, I am choosing, and then one of those three. So I am choosing creativity, or I am choosing solitude. And essentially what that's doing is trying to reframe a negative experience that is specific to the pandemic. So I pulled those from things that I think are happening right now.
Dusty, I have a question.
Yeah.
So with regards to elective stress, right? I know some people enjoy quote unquote suffering. They enjoy that part of, let's say, the workout or doing hard challenges like going out and running a marathon or something. But how would you discern that if, for someone, let's say, for example, for me, I don't typically like the feeling of suffering, but I mean, I understand what you're saying with like growth can happen through adversity. So how would you discern how to, moderate or choose what kind of stress would be appropriate to then grow out of it? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a great question. My first response is that I get it, right? Like sometimes suffering in a hard workout is that's not fun. So I think a key word with the elective stress practice is elective, like it's something that you choose to do. Actually, in psychology, that's one way that something is not traumatic. If you have a choice to do it or not do it, that affects whether or not it's calculated as traumatic. So if you didn't have a choice, it's more likely that it's a traumatic experience, right? So obviously you're selecting something, it's elective, it's something you're choosing to do. Research also shows that level of growth can correspond with level of challenge, right? So level of growth can correspond with level of trauma. And so I think that's something to remember, because that means that you can do a little and grow a little. That's great. You could engage in a very light physical practice and attach it to the mindful meditation and communal response and experience growth. That's a reality for growth. I would also say in my research, it doesn't have to be physical. Challenge and elective stress could be something different for someone else. Could be public speaking, engaging in a regular practice of public speaking. It could be in maybe your practice is not exploding at your children when they come home from school, right? Maybe you're going to set a goal that when my kids come home from school for 10 minutes, when they come home, I'm going to repeat a mantra, a mindfulness meditation in my head that is going to lead me to growth. So it doesn't have to be physical for there to be growth. There was a study done among high school students a few years ago where they changed the slides on on a PowerPoint presentation. They made the text more difficult to read. So you really had to focus in, and it was really hard to read. Those students, the students who had those slides, had statistically significant higher test scores than the students who did not use those slides. So the idea here is that what's happening is that it's forcing your brain to focus on something, and you're actually creating new neural pathways in your brain. Because often in the moment of trauma, like if you've ever been through a tough time, or if you've run a marathon, often your mind goes to, why am I so slow? Why is this so hard? I should have trained more. Or if you're in the moment of trauma, something more serious, why wasn't I prepared for this? Why do I feel so miserable? You go to all of these like self-doubt, negativity spaces. And what actually needs to happen is your brain needs to create new pathways. It needs to create new pathways to follow towards growth and positivity rather than negativity. And so what happens is adversity, this elective stress practice, allows you to create something that's difficult, so your mind has to focus on the growth.
Dusty, I have a question. Dusty, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, I want to make sure I heard you correctly. So we were talking about the mindful meditation, words can bring life or death. I choose life. And then you said something about like in a difficult CrossFit workout, when you're facing extreme adversity, you go to that meditation. Is that what I heard you say?
That's right.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so very practically, as I'm doing burpees, in my mind, as I'm breathing, I'm saying death and life is in the power of the tongue. I choose life, right?
Okay.
And so that's something that I would repeat. If there were a clicker going in my head during a 15-minute workout, that may run through my head 200 times.
Wow.
So it's just running through. It's not unlike someone who says in their mind, like, one more rep.
Right.
Or if you're running a marathon, maybe your mantra is like, one more mile, just get to the next mile, except I'm hacking it for an area of growth that I desire to
it's different. It's not part of that workout.
Right.
So is there in your research, did you find that in some ways that's different or more effective than the mindful meditation where you are focusing on that one thing? Or is it just a supplement to where in your moments of stress, you go to that?
Yeah. I think what needs to happen next, like when I wrote my master's thesis, you have to write a segment on next steps for research. My next step is I need a lot of people to do this so I can test it. Right. So right now it's anecdotal. Right now I presented a concept that I think is rooted in the research. I just need 200 people to suffer with me, and then we can test, and then I could be able to answer that directly.
Okay. One more. I used to know of a sales company that practically made it a requirement. It was such part of the company ethos is that you took a cold shower in the morning, a completely cold shower. And I think it sounded like they were trying to tap into this whole idea of elective adversity too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
I love that. That's I think that's a really helpful tool. And that gets at what Aaron was asking about. I think there are a lot of different ways that you can practice this and employ this. So that's what I would kind of call step 2. Like today's step 1, understanding that growth is possible through trauma, but then also understanding that growth is possible through elective adversity.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you.
Hi, Dusty. I have a question for you.
Hi.
Hi. So I imagine that there might be people in all of our lives that if we came and said, hi, like I did a Lululemon class and they were telling me about adversity and these are the things I learned, they'd be like, okay, I didn't sign up for that, so I'm not sure why you're bringing this to me.
Sure.
Do you have any recommendations as to how we could bring this to somebody a little bit more authentically or genuinely instead of being like, this is a task for me, but really I'm trying to help you?
Yeah, no, that's great. It's a really great question. And I would start by saying, anytime we interact with human beings, like we share to the level that we feel like that trust has been established. So for example, I don't share marital struggles with random people on the street, right? They haven't earned my trust. Challenges that I'm experiencing in my relationship or in work, I share that with my close friends, but we've established that trust. So absolutely, like, just seeing someone on the subway or seeing someone at the street and say, hey, I've got to share about this growth that I've been experiencing. So I think a great way to engage in that conversation is checking in with people. It's very genuine. I think especially right now, you could ask anyone on the street, hey, how you doing? And it's been a crazy season of life. Like, how are you handling this? And based on how they respond, I think would give me cues as to whether or not this person is safe to go a little bit further, right? So if they say, I'm totally fine, this is great, I'm doing great, awesome, that kind of shuts down the conversation. But if someone were to say, yeah, it's been a rough season, then I would follow up and say, or have you been doing anything that has helped you get through the day? Like, what are you doing? And then use your questions to allow them to invite you into their space. That would be my recommendation.
Great. Thank you.
I have a question, Dusty. This is more about, I guess, out of curiosity and knowing like the mantra, this statement that you're saying to yourself during your CrossFit workouts. Obviously, you're reframing the experience. I'm wondering what experience you're reframing there when you're saying that mantra to yourself.
Yeah. So in that moment, I'm reframing the suffering of the sweat, right? So it's allowing me to not have a negative, like, man, that was a really hard workout, or, oh, these are burpees and I'm so bad at burpees. Everyone in here is faster at burpees than I am. So it's allowing me to reframe what would typically be a negative experience for a positive experience. But obviously, like, drastically different on emotional level than something like quarantine or something traumatic. And this is what my caveat is, like, no one would choose trauma. Like, I don't think elective stress and the practice of adversity is necessarily, something that I recommend to people in the sense of, like, you wouldn't choose cancer, but if you've got it, this is an opportunity to grow. And so that's why the elective stress, the practice of adversity, bringing it into elective side is more palatable. It's something that I think is more positive. Thoughts, questions?
I got one.
Yeah.
My name's Johnny. I'm from the Calabasas store.
Glad you're here.
I was just wondering about like the phases, I mean, I've been through some stuff that I wouldn't like to talk about, but I feel like I've gone through like damages, and then there's like irreparable damages. And then just when would you start your growth? When would it be after you're so damaged to the point where they're like, okay, I'm at rock bottom? Or is it through the damage phase where you start getting a little bit of growth?
Yeah.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks for that's like a really real question. So thank you for sharing that. My first response would be research shows that post-traumatic growth is not the opposite of post-traumatic stress. So it's not like one or the other happens. They often happen concurrently. So as someone is experiencing a response to trauma, you can also be experiencing growth. But just because you're experiencing growth doesn't mean that you're stress-free and that trauma is done. And so on that level, scientifically, they can occur together. One of the things that was really interesting as I was exploring this is that the military, the Army, has been really interested in the realm of post-traumatic growth, because when you sign up to join the military, you're essentially signing up for trauma, right? If you are a combat arms occupational specialty, it's essentially built into the job description that you will be put in a traumatic situation. Most of us on our day-to-day basis, we don't know if we're going to experience trauma. I don't know if I'm going to be in a car crash. I don't know if I'll develop cancer. Soldiers know they're going to experience trauma. So about 10 years ago, they started something that they called a comprehensive soldier fitness plan. And it's essentially doing some of the things that I've shared today to prepare them for trauma. So it's preemptively preparing them to grow in the aftermath of trauma. So I would say, to answer your question, post-traumatic growth can happen in the midst of trauma, but you can also prepare for growth prior to trauma. So it really can be implemented at any point in the journey.
Thank you.
Does any of your research show, kind of going off of Johnny's question, is there a point where one can get so damaged that it's not repairable? Or can you choose that trauma, even if it's in the past, as something that can help you grow?
The first one I have an easy answer to, in that research has been conducted that shows the level of trauma can correlate with the level of growth. So based on a particular study, the more serious, the more farther, the more deeper, the more painful the trauma was, that correlated with higher levels of growth as well. So based on that research, I would say, no, there's not a point that you're too far gone to experience growth. Remind me of your second question.
Is there a point where the trauma can be too far in the past to grow from? So if something really awful happened in childhood and I'm, someone in my 30s, is it too late to use that as like a spark for growth?
That's a great question. I'm not aware of any specific research that has addressed that. There have been hundreds of studies and I have not read them all. So I don't know. I would point you to one of my mentors in this whole world is a guy named Captain Charlie Plum. Charlie Plum was a Vietnam veteran. His plane was shot down. He spent 2,103 days in the Hanoi Hilton, which is the same prisoner of war camp that John McCain lived in. And he is now a speaker and travels the world talking about his experience. And he talks about the fact that he did not know that he had experienced post-traumatic growth until after it was defined in 1995 by these two researchers. So he said for him, it was really enlightening to have a phrase and a term to describe something that he had been experiencing since prison camp, the PO prisoner of war camp in the 70s. So I think the research would say you can look back and revisit old experiences and use them for growth. I just haven't read any specific research on it.
Hey, Dusty, this is Jessica.
Jessica.
Hi. So you were talking about your mantra, and is there any, in terms of developing a mantra when experiencing elective stress, is there any like helpful element or to have the mantra be related like specifically to? Like, I know you said that yours is more about like thinking about the words you say as opposed to like 1 more mile. But like if you're in other types of elective stress situations, is it helpful to have the mantra be like more specific to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think two different things. If in this kind of part 2 conversation that I'm suggesting, like we could have, one of the things that I do when I present the practice of elective stress and this practice of adversity, unrelated from trauma. So if we were doing it not in quarantine during a global pandemic, we would look at this slightly different. We would be looking more from a personal development angle, right? And so one of the first things in the step number 1 in this process is assessing an area in your life that you want to grow in. And that's not an individual process, it's a communal process. So you're talking with your mentors, you're talking with your coworkers. One of the things that can be done is a 360 review where you're getting feedback from a lot of different people in your life, and that's guiding you towards a desired area of growth. And then you're selecting your mindful meditation in a way that draws you towards that growth. And so what I would say in that is some basic recommendations is it has to be something that you can remember and repeat during adversity. right? So if you've got like a 3-paragraph long quote that you want to memorize, it's going to be really hard to do that in the middle of burpees, right? So keeping it short, a sentence, a phrase that is repeatable. For breath work, if you're attaching this to a yoga practice, I would be thinking about a phrase that can be spoken in your mind on the inhale. So half of the phrase on the inhale and half of the phrase on the exhale. Half of the phrase on the inhale and half of the phrase on the exhale. So I think that's one very practical tool. I think quotes are great. I think texts from religious texts are great. Or it could even be a buzzword, something that draws you back to the desired area of growth. All right. Any other questions, thoughts, comments, any pushback? Anyone that would say like, I don't know, I'm not sold. Like, I think this is, I'm not in. What? I'm open to anything.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you keep saying religion or spiritual. What about people that don't have that? Or do you think that on some level everyone has some type of connection somewhere?
It's a great question. And I would refer to the research, as I mentioned before. Not everyone experiences growth in all 5 domains. So it's possible that someone who has a religious connection could go through a traumatic experience and not experience growth in their religious realm. So it's not necessarily someone who is or isn't religious that experiences growth. But I think it can happen for those who have a religious connection. It can also happen for those who don't. I think research would show that there are times when people who don't have any sort of faith or religion or spiritual connection, that is cultivated or sparked through that experience. And I think that's reflected in the 5-point scale. If you remember back to the post-traumatic growth inventory, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I think the way that would be assessed is it's possible that someone may have a 1 or a 2, someone else may have a 5 in their spiritual growth, and some people may have a 0.
Do you think that whether you have a spiritual religion, faith will help you in your growth with the post-traumatic growth? Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you think having that helps? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I'll splice my response into 2 realms. A personal non-academic response. Like I think so. I just from my heart, like I think identifying God or something beyond yourself that guides you, I think can impact that. Academically, based on the research, I don't know what studies have been done that show post-traumatic growth and its connection to religion and how religion affects the outcome, right? So I don't know if there have been research studies done on people who have high religious identity and also high post-traumatic growth results or not. I'm not sure what is out there.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Hey, Dusty, I have a question. Have you experienced, or in your studies, have you seen people go through the strength, but then get triggered by another type of trauma and revert back? Or do you see people, they gain that strength and then it's just easier to carry forward with the new trauma or something, a similar occurring trauma?
It's a really great question. Again, I think most of the research shows that it's not a one-way path, right? Like post-traumatic growth is not necessarily increasing and keeps going up and up and up and up, and you get stronger and stronger and stronger. I think the research would show that it's more like this in some ways, and maybe sometimes it's like this, and sometimes it's like this. So I think the research would show that it's variable, and for sure. Trauma or maybe undiscussed or undisclosed trauma could be brought up through the process that would bring stress. But I think the research also shows that that's not necessarily a bad thing for growth, that even if it brings up something that was really traumatic that had not been discovered or not been discussed, it's a new opportunity to grow through that trauma as well. And I think that also connects a little bit with the buzzword resilience. Right now, like resilience is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and that's awesome. But resilience presupposes trauma or challenge or suffering. I made a post today because I was thinking about this earlier today, that believing that talking about resilience makes you resilient is like watching a fitness workout on YouTube makes you fit, right? Like you can't get fit by sitting and like watching someone work out on screen. You can't become resilient by talking about resilience. You can't become resilient by reading about resilience. Post-traumatic growth and the process of trauma, or even without it being traumatic, stress is critical for resilience, right? So in that sense, I would say that the more trauma you've experienced, the more challenges people face, it has the potential to increase your resilience over time. Great question, Ria.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi, I had a question. Have you seen anything about kind of the difference between like a more visible trauma? And for me, I think I've had a harder time during this time because it's like invisible almost, where you don't know where this thing is. Have you seen anything kind of a difference of how people handle that or react to that trauma, or when it might hit you, as compared to a very like visible in your face, like someone dying in front of you, as compared to this prolonged kind of really weird place?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great question. And I actually think a really important relational pastoral question, because often what I find is that we start comparing our traumas, we start comparing our sufferings, or we start comparing even at like at a fun level. You know, if you see someone who's run a marathon, it's like, wow, they've ran a marathon. But then when a woman or a man walks in who's run 100-mile race, it's like, wow, they're really. So we often create these hierarchies of suffering or hierarchies of challenge. And academically, the research doesn't support that, because trauma or suffering or stress, as it would be measured, is a self-reporting scale. So what that means is that it's your perception of the challenge. That's the level of trauma that you've experienced. So for example, Cecily and I are a great example of this. Like, and this is probably actually connected to your personalities, the big five personalities. So Cecily and I, we can go through a challenging situation and I leave that and I'm usually the one freaking out. I'm like, oh my gosh, that was so crazy. My heart is racing. I'm sweating. That was like I'm really nervous. And I'll look at Cecily and she'll say, oh, that wasn't that big of a deal. So we had the same experience. And on a spectrum of 1 to 10, I had an 8 out of 10. That was 8 out of 10 suffering, pain. For her, it's like a 3, right? So I think the research would suggest that you can't compare traumatic experiences. So what you're experiencing is as real as what someone else is experiencing from a physical realm. So for example, if someone had lost their leg in combat, that's a very physical, like people would see that, like, yeah, that person doesn't have a leg, they stepped on an IED, versus someone thinking about maybe a mother who has lost a child through an ectopic pregnancy or something like that. That is a very invisible pain, but it is a very real pain. And so I think that's true for quarantine, for pandemic, that some people physically have coronavirus and are in the hospital right now. And some of us are at home and we're just avoiding going out. But academically, the way that would be gauged is that you could be experiencing equal levels of pain. I don't know if that answers the question. But.
For sure, it does. Because as someone who's been through stuff, I self-analyze my trauma, grief, etc. So that was helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for asking that question.
I think we can take like one more question if there's one burning out there. So if you've been waiting till now, I would say embrace vulnerability and pop off mute while we have this lovely gentleman with us. And I'm not afraid to hold you hostage until you ask it. There's one more, I feel it. You can get a feeling for what kind of a boss I am. Yeah, let's do one more. If you're afraid, just click unmute. It's gonna be fine, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, I have a question. Do you think it's important, like if you've gone through a traumatic experience, but yet you feel that it hasn't greatly affected you, but it's greatly affected everyone around you, so you kind of feel like, oh man, maybe it did affect me more than I think? Do you feel that it's necessary to still go through the processing and the trying to find the trauma and all of that in that situation, even though you may feel totally fine, or if you feel fine, then great, and you just kind of move on?
It's a great question. I, I think I think it's important to be honest with yourself and recognize that your perception of an experience is its reality. And I think other people's perception of the same experience should not force you to rethink your perception of an experience. So their opinion doesn't necessarily invalidate your opinion. But I also think that through community, there are times that our community can help us see our areas for growth as well. So there are times in my life when I'll tell Cecily, I'll tell my wife, I don't really see that, but I trust you enough that I'm going to believe it, and I'm going to live in and respond to it as if it were true for me. But I think that I don't do that with everyone. I don't do that with the person on the street I don't do that with the person on the street who tells me I should shave my beard because they don't like beards, right? Like I don't really value your opinion. I'm not making life changes based on their opinion. But the people in my life who I really trust and believe in, I'm willing to assess that more honestly or more seriously when they would say that. But I would also say that at the end of the day, your experience, your personal feelings about an experience is true. It's your reality for that. Thank you for asking that question.
I know we were gonna call it after that, but something about your question, McKenna, also like kind of triggered something in my head. And like your thoughts on something, and you can maybe feel fine. Like, no, I think I'm okay after like that trauma, when other people, when you explain it, can react a little more strongly or something hearing it. Is there something like, I mean, maybe you haven't fully processed it, or like your brain is doing something to protect it? So maybe this isn't even a comment, more of a statement, but like your brain is there and it's like sheltering you and protecting you because that's maybe how you survived your childhood and or whatever it was. And you think like, oh no, I've talked about, I've worked through it, but maybe you haven't. So I don't know if that's a question even, but more of something that like sparked in my head.
Yeah, I think my response would be I'm a huge fan of counseling and therapy, and I think anytime trauma is involved or perceived trauma, or maybe you're not sure if something was traumatic, absolutely connect with someone who has professional training and skill in that area. And I think that's one way to, even if you're not sure, it's good to check in, chat with someone, and maybe through your conversations, you would find that maybe you are, maybe there is a repressed memory or experience that you hadn't dealt with, or maybe you would find that you're okay. But I think I would defer to an expert on something like that for sure.
Okay. Well, I think I can speak for all of us by saying that was incredible. And I took pages of notes. And I'm so grateful for all of these tools right now in this tricky time. A reminder to listeners, if you haven't put your email into the chat, if you want a copy of the recording, please do so now. So I'll save the chat and make sure you get it. And when I send out the link to this call, this is a really good opportunity to actually share with some people who are on your different circles, just like Dusty was talking about earlier. And then Dusty, do you want to tell people where they can find you digitally if they want to stay up to date on what you're passionate about?
Yeah, absolutely. You can connect with me on Instagram, just Dusty Breeding, and you can connect with me on Facebook. You can also connect with me on my website, which has a blog and a podcast that I've been in the process of launching called Stories of Resilience, where I've been sitting with people and asking them about challenges that they've been through and what they've done to endure and what tips they would pass on. That's all on my website, dustybreeding.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dusty. This was really great.
Thank you to my Lululemon Calabasas family for hosting. Great to see you all.
Thank you so much.